Divorce ranches were a thing in the 1950s and 1960s, in the times before no-fault divorce, which didn't become legal in some states until 1969. Women who were denied the right to divorce could live in these ranches or hotels to establish residency. Then they could file for divorce in a Nevada court. The clients or tenants of these ranches were mainly women from New York and New Jersey and other states who went west searching for what was commonly and colloquially known as the Reno Cure. Nevada had passed a law back in 1932 that made it the quickest state in which to get a divorce. A 6-week period is all that was required to establish a residency in order to be able to file for divorce. Sounds like a compelling place to situate a novel with characters who are lonely and scared, women, some of whom are on their own for the first time, and women who must spend 6 weeks in residency trying to get along with everyone else. It's not always an easy transaction. And those are some of the tensions we see in Rowan Beaird's novel, The Divorcées. Lois Saunders really thought that marrying the right man would cure the loneliness she'd felt all her life. But her marriage is loveless. Unhappiness was not grounds for divorce in 1951, except in Reno, Nevada, at the Golden Yarrow, to be precise. This was considered to be one of the most respectable of the divorce ranches in Reno. The women there spend their time riding horses or swimming in the pool. Their personalities emerge, and life is a little more tense than not. Enter Greer Lang. Lois's life becomes even more complicated. I spoke to author Rowan Beaird about her novel, The Divorcées. I want to know, the setting of the novel is a divorce ranch known as the Golden Yarrow. Can you give us just a summary of the novel and tell us about Lois? And then we'll talk some more about the Golden Yarrow.
Yeah, of course. So The Divorcées is set in 1951, and it's about a sheltered young woman named Lois who travels to the Golden Yarrow, which is one of Reno's famous divorce ranches. And while there, she becomes obsessed with this mysterious, glamorous fellow guest named Greer. And over the course of their friendship and Lois's stay at the ranch, she basically has to decide whether or not to trust Greer and whether or not Greer is a threat to the independence and freedom that she really craves. And Lois, for the protagonist of the book, I feel like there were so many different directions I could have gone because there's so many incredible, inspiring real women that traveled to Reno at the time that I read about. But I really wanted Lois to be an outsider, someone who was uncomfortable in their own skin, who was trying to find their place in the world. I really wanted her to be a searcher so that when somebody like Greer appears in her life who's so magnetic, you understand why she's immediately drawn to her.
I just love this character of Lois. As you say, she's a searcher. She seems to want to be really independent, and in some situations, I get the sense like she's going through the motions of, dating and dating this particular guy and marrying this particular one, but still there's something not quite right. And even among the women at the ranch, it's not that she's an introvert necessarily. It's just that she holds other things, I think, of slightly more importance and significance to her than the women at the ranch.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that she's not also, sort of carefree and fun loving in her own ways, as we
Mhm.
see. But I just find her to be such a rich character and so complex. There's this thing with the women about the label of divorcee, of the stigma almost of it. I was thinking back to this episode of Happy Days of all
Oh.
things, where there's an episode where there's a divorced woman, and Richie and Patsy and all the guys are acting really weird about her, and they say, "Oh,
Mhm.
she's hot to trot." And I just remember being really young and watching this and thinking, what in the world? What is wrong with being a divorced woman? And there was just like this weird imprint from such a young age about that idea. And that was, reading the novel and thinking about that stigma for these women. It was a real issue for them. It was a real problem for them, wasn't it?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, it really made you a social pariah. And I think that that's something that was so fascinating to me when I started doing my research into this period of time is that, to make the decision that the women in this novel make, that so many real women made during this period, some were had their hands forced, some were escaping, abusive marriages, but some of them were also just deciding that they wanted to start a new life completely on their own. And though that feels very understandable and accessible to us today, at the time, that was a decision of incredible bravery because, as you said, as you experienced watching that Happy Days episode, you were really in many ways deciding that you weren't going to be allowed into certain social circles, or that if you were, people would always be whispering behind your back. And so, yeah, it took an incredible amount of bravery.
Can you explain what a divorce ranch is? I've been walking around carrying your book around, and people will ask me about it, and they're and the book is so beautiful, and they
Oh,
ask
thank
me
you.
about it, and they're like, "Divorce ranch, what?" So there are people today who have no clue about the existence of divorce ranches, which I find really interesting. And somebody did say to me, "Wow, what a concept! What a great concept for a novel."
Oh, that's so wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of them. I actually found out about them on, hilariously enough, my bachelorette party in Las Vegas. Um,
I love it.
and yeah, my husband loves that I was thinking about divorce on my my
Oh.
bachelorette weekend. But I found out about them because we had this tour guide that told us a bit about the history of Nevada, and she at some point said, everybody knows Las Vegas is famously where you get married, and Reno is famously where you get divorced. And I raised my hand and said, I've never heard that about Reno. What are you talking about? And she told me about how, starting in 1931, to help recover from the Great Depression, Nevada made two really important decisions. They legalized gambling and they changed their divorce requirements so that if you were to move to the state for just 6 weeks, you could separate from your spouse for whatever reason, which was radically different than any other state at the time. So, of course, women from working class backgrounds would come to Reno and they'd work as waitresses, they'd work at casinos during their stay. But for the rich and the famous, they would stay at these divorce ranches, which were basically, exactly what you'd imagine a ranch to be. They'd spend their days learning how to ride horses and swimming. They'd spend their evenings gambling at casinos and often having affairs with cowboys. And so their period in Reno was this very unique, often glamorous experience, even though, as we shared before, of course, there's, a dark side to all of their stories. But I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, again, when I learned about them, I thought, of course, a novel has to be set on a divorce ranch. There just felt like so much potential.
Oh, it's such an inspired idea. And the women are allowed to leave the ranch. They're not just sort of trapped there, and it's not like a prison by any means. As you say, they get to go out and gamble and dine and date. They can go into town and see their lawyers too, but they have to spend 6 weeks on the ranch. And they have to claim a particular reason for the divorce, but they seem sort of, I don't know, kind of squishy reasons.
Yes, yes.
And there are children on the ranch too sometimes, right?
Yes. So, often women, and as you can imagine at the time, although there were men that traveled to Reno to separate from their spouses, it was mostly women just for often economic reasons. I mean, they didn't have full-time jobs, so they were the ones that could actually take 6 weeks away from their normal lives. And some would leave their children behind with grandparents or with other family members, but often women would travel with their children. And so on the Reno Divorce History Project website, which is this really incredible project from the University of Nevada. They have transcripts, interviews with women who traveled to the divorce ranches. And there are some from children who remember the experience and reflect on this odd period that felt almost like summer camp, not realizing this huge transition and in many ways crisis that their mothers were going through.
And so the other women on the ranch, like Mary Elizabeth and the others, did you gain inspiration from this research that you did for those particular? Because it's such a richly diverse group. Like I just love how different they were and their backstory. Where did they come from?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, they were definitely inspired by real women. I mean, I think something that was important to me, and originally there were a lot more women on the ranch, and my lovely editor gently suggested that we limit the cast of characters because I think it was a bit unwieldy.
Oh,
But I just I just had so many ideas. I was like, but no, these are all real women, and I want to kind of bring them to life on the page, but I definitely, in the cast of characters, wanted to give readers a sense for all of the different reasons that women would travel to Reno at that time. As I said before, sometimes they were getting divorced because they had abusive husbands or because they had, incredibly irresponsible husbands that really couldn't head a household in any way. Sometimes it was because they'd fallen in love with somebody else, or sometimes it's a character like Lois who just knows that they don't want to be with their husband anymore, that they want to be on their own. And so I wanted to offer little windows into all of those different possibilities.
oh, so it's so good to see that, and each one represents like some, variation on the theme of the reason for the divorce. It's so fascinating to me. And enter Greer Lang. There's mystery and more than just waiting out, 6 weeks with her. So can you talk a little bit about Greer?
Yeah, Greer, in her simplest form, I really wanted her to be a cool girl. I really wanted her to be, I think many women can relate to this, a figure that we've had at different points in our lives where we meet somebody and they just have this immediate magnetism and confidence. And you feel a combination of both wanting to be with them, wanting to be their friend and be close to them, but also wanting to be them, wanting to embody those incredible qualities that they have. And so I wanted her to be somebody that, in a world in which women had very little power, was really adamant about gaining power wherever she could and exerting that power and control over others. With the idea of Lois as somebody who's very uncomfortable in her own skin and very much trying to find herself, I knew that the person that she would be drawn to would be somebody who had a strong sense of self and, was defying societal expectations and kind of opening paths to different lives that Lois and the other girls at the ranch didn't think were possible.
Something else that was so effective for me, well, so many things, but is that you ground the elements of this particular very specific time period in movies.
Mm. Oh,
I just
good.
love reading about, Lois's crush on, William Holden and Cary Grant and all of this. And it just puts you in that place. The fashions of the time, the particular garments that you specifically name, or the movies that they were interested in, or the movie stars that they were interested in, it just puts you there. And so I know you did a lot of research on the divorce ranches, but what kind of research did you do for these other elements?
Yeah, I of course loved learning about the history of Nevada and the history of even divorce law in this country is its own fascinating topic. But when I realized that I was going to be writing a historical fiction novel, something that I had never specifically sat down and decided I was going to do, and I found that really intimidating. And I knew that I would, of course, have to learn about, that moment in history and what people would have recently gone through, specifically for this with World War II. But I also wanted to bring real texture to the novel. And I think that was why I turned to consuming art that was made during that time period. So My father loves cinema, so we grew up watching a lot of classic films from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and onward. And so I got to return to a lot of those movies and, paying particular attention to how women were portrayed in those films and what sort of idealized versions of femininity Lois would be ingesting and making sense of. And so, film is, as you noted, is very important to the book, and it's how Lois sees the world and how she's kind of initially able to dream up different futures for herself. But it was also really important for me to, listen to music from that time period, to read novels set during that time period. I think that a lot of us have a very kind of sterile, leave it to beaver
Yes.
sense of what the 1950s were. But when you read the novels from that time, when you look at, something that was particularly inspiring was the work of a lot of the female abstract expressionists from that period, like Helen Frankenthaler and Elaine de Kooning, were just painting these angry, beautiful, bold canvases. You realize that people's inner lives were just as messy and complicated as they are today.
You're right. It is that immersive. It's such an immersive thing to go into this novel and feel like you're of that time, that you're really sort of witnessing this. But even though that's true, and it is hard to think that this takes place, oh my gosh, over 70 years ago now.
Yeah.
And yet there are elements that are, I don't know, so timeless in regards to women and men and friendships, marriage, social expectations. We still have them. What do you think all these years later? So much here, so many elements about relationships and dynamics of these relationships. They can still be so resonant in 2024, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. And I'm so glad that you felt that deeply. I think that when I started writing this book, I was very fixed on this idea of this is a historical novel and it's set in the 1950s, and it's my duty as a writer to faithfully represent that period of time. And the more time that I spent writing it and really putting myself in the position of these women and thinking deeply about their fears and desires, the more I realized how much they're a mirror of the fears and desires of women today. I think in that sort of idealized vision of the 1950s that we have, that's a way of us keeping it at a distance and thinking that, oh gosh, well, we've come so far from that period in time. We don't have women in swing dresses waiting for their husbands with a roast when they come home from work every day and handing them a martini. But a lot of those dynamics, a lot of, as you noted, the gender dynamics, a lot of the same issues of power, they are very present. And I think even around the issue of divorce, divorce is obviously very common. I mean, it's almost half of marriages end up, ending in a state of divorce. And I think because it's so much more accessible, because it's so much more common, we like to think that it's acceptable and that we've made great strides in our public understanding of divorces. But I think that there are many lingering feelings of disapproval. And I think that, although divorcees might not quite be social pariahs, thank God, in 2024, there's still this judgment that comes when you get divorced, this feeling that you failed in some way. And that's not so different from how, women especially were viewed in the 1950s, almost like damaged goods.
Rowan Beaird, thank you so much for talking to me about the Divorcées. What a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Rowan Beaird is the author of the novel The Divorcées. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Eva Benavides.